Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show here on The Real News. I'm Marc Steiner. It's good to have you with us. And welcome to another edition of Not in Our Name. Rebecca Ruth Gould is our guest today. She's written a profoundly important book called Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. This work weaves a deeply analytical tale of the contradictions and complexities of anti-Semitism, intertwined with anti-Semitism at the root of Zionism, how the struggle against anti-Semitism was hijacked by xenophobia and Islamophobia, how the battles surrounding free speech in our world complicate an already complex reality. And through it all, she also talks about how great Marxist activists and thinkers like Isaac Deutscher and Leon Abram may offer a path of understanding, that anti-Semitism's demise is wrapped up in Palestinian liberation. And Ruth Gould is also the author of numerous other books, so let me tell you what some of them are. They are Writers and Rebels, The Persian Prison Poem, Prison Hunger Strikes in Palestine, and she's written for numerous publications, London Review of Books, Globe and Mail, and many others, and her work has been translated into 11 languages, which is really impressive. So I want to thank you for joining us today. This is I really good to have you here.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And I want to open with your poem, the piece of it you wrote, because I want to talk about how this all began with your sojourn to Israel and Palestine, and what brought you there, and what you discovered, your rude awakening of sorts when you got there. And this poem you have on page 2, workers greet the dawn behind the bars of checkpoint 300, waiting to build settlers' homes with stolen limestone. So talk a bit about your sojourn, how this book actually began because of going to Israel, Palestine to live and work.
Sure. So this was 2011, and I had just received my PhD. I was actually living in Berlin at the time and sort of not knowing what the future held. I did have a degree in Middle Eastern studies, but that was mostly to do with Iran. So I'd never been to Israel or Palestine. I very much wanted to go. And I was offered a fellowship at an Israeli research institute called the Van Leer Institute, that is sort of on the very much, to the extent that there is a left at all within Israel, it's as far as one can get and survive. And so they do some good work. They have Palestinian academics, for example, but every institution has its limits. Anyway, I accepted the offer after kind of a little bit of internal struggle, but I just so desperately wanted to have the opportunity to live there, particularly to live in Palestine, even though, of course, the institute was in Jerusalem. So what happened was I found a place to live in Bethlehem. And then I just commuted through the checkpoint 300 that I mentioned, that does kind of loom very large in my imagination and my memory, and I think in the lives of countless Palestinians as well. It's this sort of industrial warehouse where people wait for, as I wrote, for just like 5 or 6 hours. The lines aren't moving. Anyway, so that was like the texture of my life. I was right by the wall. And I was really, the time I had spent there definitely made a big impact. But the thing that stood out most was just this sense of like two totally separate worlds that are right next to each other, right? Because Bethlehem is literally just a very short walk from Jerusalem, but it's it could be 4 hours, just waiting in line, the commutes. And half of that time is, you're standing like near these loaded guns being facing you. So it's very sort of traumatic journey. And it was just so strange because, these worlds are next to each other. They're woven together historically. They have so much in common. And yet, Israelis don't cross the line. They never go to the West Bank. In fact, they're technically forbidden. And most Palestinians cannot leave either. So that's kind of, that it's kind of like visual embodiment of the idea of apartheid, but not just in a legal sense, but just every aspect of life. And I think that was a bit overwhelming.
I mean, you get the sense from how you wrote in the beginning of the book that it was, even though you're not a naive human being walking into where you were going, it was shocking nevertheless. The depth of it seemed to shock you a great deal.
Exactly. Because it's the kind of thing that I personally couldn't live more than, certainly more than a year in that. It is just that total schizophrenia. Yeah. So, I knew like the general sense of the politics and so forth, but just the daily schizophrenia of it I was not quite prepared for that.
So one of the things that I love in the beginning, you have this great quote, and I think you spend a lot of time throughout the book, and we'll weave in and out of this, talking about Isaac Deutscher, and a couple of other people. And I was you made me kind of go back and kind of look at all my old Deutscher notes as I was.
Awesome. I
'Cause
love that. I love plugs for Deutscher. He's kind of forgotten these days, so that's
he
happy to hear
has
that.
been forgotten in many ways, but I remember seeing him at the Socialist Scholars Conference. I forget it was either in '66 or
Wow,
'67 in New York. Um,
amazing.
yeah,
Hmm.
listening to him there, and reading all of his books. But he wrote this, which I think is really profound, and it's a good way to start this off. He says,
Mhm,
and you quote him saying, "It's a tragic and macabre truth that the greatest redefiner of the Jewish identity has been Hitler.
mhm.
Auschwitz was the terrible cradle of the new Jewish consciousness and the new Jewish nation." And from his essay, "Who is a Jew?" which I thought was a profoundly important essay. Um,
Yes.
and so, I mean, so one of the things that strikes me about your book, and this is kind of overarching to start with, is that contradiction. Is these
Mhm.
contradictions of how anti-Semitism, in many ways, was at the root of the founding of Israel, and how that
Yes.
it pushed it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and so talk a bit about that and kind of your discovery around that.
Sure, and I think I could also sort of tell the end of the story of what the introduction introduces, why I wrote the book, because I wrote an article called
Right.
Beyond Anti-Semitism that got me in a lot of trouble. Yeah, well, it's just simply as you said, Israel was founded because of anti-Semitism at a sort of industrial scale, and that's a trauma that I think is very much alive. I mean, it shapes very Israeli sort of life. I mean, based on I'm thinking of my conversations at the Van Leer Institute, having dinners with people, and just how they would kind of process the legacy of that history. I think a lot of the Israelis I spoke with, at least, were aware, who was sort of a little bit maybe on the left, critical of their society and so forth. But they themselves said that the state was using that trauma in a way to kind of silence the discussion about the occupation. And actually, there's a really wonderful. I really want to make a plug for Amos Goldberg, who's a professor at Hebrew University, a professor of Holocaust studies. Actually, he's sheds so much light on this question. He has a very provocative and perhaps to some very controversial, but very eye-opening article about the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust museum in Israel, and and the way in which that the memory is kind of packaged, and it's the traumas. I mean, yeah, it's still I guess suppose not fully processed, and I think a lot of these controversies that we're having around defining anti-Semitism, yeah, has to do with that.
So one of the things that I thought about as I was reading the book, and especially when I finished it, was that, and you touched on this throughout the book, but I'm very curious to probe it a bit more, which is your own journey.
Mhm. Mhm.
Your journey from being, I mean, when I read your name, it sounds like a Jewish name, Rebecca Gould.
Uh-huh. Sure.
But your family's kind of losing who they were as Jews over a couple of generations, and you're kind of rediscovering that through the eyes of Jewish Marxists and your time in Israel, and exploring this world. So
Sure.
talk a bit about that, because I think that really, I mean, it's not traumatic, but it
It
begins
was
to,
transformational,
yeah,
perhaps you could say.
transformational is
Uh-huh.
the word. Yeah,
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 absolutely. I would say that in a sense, I kind of always knew these details of my family history, but I had not really reflected on them in a kind of in-depth way, because I certainly wasn't raised Jewish. But
you were
when
raised
I was
Catholic,
accused of
right?
anti, well, secular, yes, secular
Gotcha,
Catholic,
gotcha. Yes, yeah, right. Yes,
exactly,
right. I
yeah,
understand. Yeah, yeah,
traditionally.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but it did come as quite a shock to be accused of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's I think that accusation has become very banal in kind of pro-Palestinian circles, because it's often misused and abused and so forth. But I just never thought that when I was writing the Beyond Anti-Semitism, it was like the furthest thing. You know what I mean? I was just kind of filtering what Israelis were telling me, what was being said on Israeli media, left wing, and so forth. And so it was like I just had to process that, because even if I obviously did not consider myself anti-Semitic, but I was the very thought, that something I said could have been hurtful was a shock to me. It was just like, oh my God, how is this? How could that possibly have happened? And I think that took me back into a journey of just like thinking about, who am I? What am I? a very kind of personal introspective journey. At some point it did become a kind of political struggle for free speech, and that's also very important, but the first reaction was just amazement, that it could have been offensive to, well, it was offensive to British Jews, who hadn't been to Israel, hadn't been to Palestine, and so I think that's important to say. But yeah, so that, and it was great. It was fascinating to rediscover the Jewish sides of my family. Actually, this happened I was while I was writing this book, my father passed away too, and it's my father's side of the family that is of Jewish heritage, and so there's actually, I have to say, there are a lot of questions that came up that wasn't able to ask him, but at least I was able to dedicate the book to him. So yeah, so it definitely is a highly personal subject, and it has been a way of yeah. My family migrated, from deep poverty in Lodz in Poland, and they found a new life for themselves in America. But once they got to America, yeah, they changed their name. It was Goldstein. I guess they thought it didn't sound very Jewish, but maybe it does to many. And yeah, I think they just did everything they could to assimilate and erase that history.
And then you, as you just alluded to a moment ago, that you wrote about in the book, were accused of making anti-Semitic attacks in the work that you published.
Yes, and it's worth saying, right? So the work that I published in 2011, when I was living in Bethlehem. In fact, I remember when I wrote it, I just come back from Hebron, which is where some of the settler movement has, in a sense, been the most extreme. I mean, many Palestinians live in fear of their lives, and I was witnessing that. I was actually with a colleague from the Van Leer Institute, and we were sort of in a bus. I mean, we actually did go outside, but just again, this sort of dual worlds phenomenon was really overwhelming to me. And yeah, and so I wrote that article. I just think it's important to recognize, like, that's the context I wrote it in the middle of that conflict, right? And then I got to the University of Bristol 5 years later, and a student who describes himself as Israeli British, and a Zionist, came across the article. I never actually spoke to the student one on one. I still haven't. I mean, there was never a one on one conversation between us, but he, I guess, Googled my name and found that article, and then yeah, published a op-ed saying it was anti-Semitic, and it needed, yeah, to be sort of investigated, and there was a sort of slow trail of media controversy that had a big impact. I think it is the important thing to say about that is, that's not just a personal story. This had never happened before in the UK in this sense, because compared to the US, I actually went to Columbia University, where Edward Said was a professor, and there were cases of like tenure controversies around Palestinian activists and so forth. The UK didn't have that history, but what it did have is that the end of 2016, just a few months before this attack on me, was my article was published. It had adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It was the first government to do that in the world, and so that marked a kind of governmental interest in the criticism, or in preventing criticism of Israel, which I think explains a lot about why this particularly, short article of not much consequence, to be honest, it got a lot of notoriety very quickly.
So how much did that experience,
Hmm.
obviously that experience and you going there, and also kind of reclaiming where some of your ancestry came from, influence you to write this book in the first place?
Well, I think as soon as it was happening to me, I realized at some point, I was going to need to write it, to write it down, because it was just so far, again, this kind of experience of surrealism. I didn't believe that by coming to the UK, which is a country, doesn't have a First Amendment, but it's a country
Right.
that is thought of as being liberal democratic, protecting free speech. It has a concept of academic freedom. I just didn't think that an article I wrote 5 years earlier in, very different, would matter. But it did a lot. I mean, in fact, the very prominent politician called me a Holocaust denier, and he said I should be fired. He said that in one of the mainstream conservative newspapers, and so yeah, that. And what was also interesting was that I got the sense that, the university ultimately, they when it reviewed the article, they said it was not anti-Semitic and so forth. So what was interesting was that there was a very sharp contrast between, like, everyone around me sort of knew it wasn't really anti-Semitic, including the university, I think, from the beginning, but governmental pressure, governmental intrusion on this question was so intense that they were just acting at the basically the behest of the government. So the free speech, I mean, that in addition to making me, much more interested in my Jewish roots, it also just really awakened me into that free speech is actually something it's not just like this value that right wing politicians talk about. It's actually something that I
Yeah.
personally need kind of to survive as a person, because I'm being libeled for things I never said, and I'm not being at that particular moment I wasn't able to speak out because I had to kind of not cause controversy. The university, even though again, like, everyone kind of internally kind of reassured me this is not problematic, but they said don't say anything, be quiet, shut up, our media team is gonna figure this out. And there are bigger issues, right? So that sense of being suppressed, having your voice silenced, and not just my voice. I mean, what was interesting is I felt that what they did do this kind of detailed review of the article, which was really, I mean, it was wrong, I think, kind of from a kind of ethical perspective, because again, I wrote this 5 years ago, so it shouldn't have been relevant, but they did it. And they used the IHRA definition, like point by point, to figure out whether it was anti Semitic. But most importantly, they said that it was written from the United States. They didn't ask me. I mean, they just totally got that wrong. So they erased the Palestinian and the Israeli context completely. They even, they
Right.
misread it. And this was this was just like a casual thing. This was like a formal inquiry, that was supposed to be done at a very high level of professionalism, with legal counsel involved and so forth. And it was just so biased, even though it found in my favor. It was still just incredibly biased, incredibly silencing. And so that, I think, that experience of being silenced made me want to speak out, obviously. Yeah. And so that, and then seeing that happen to other people. And again, actually, at the same time, this is again worth mentioning to bring home the point that it's not just my experience or my story. Again, it's worth saying that UK had been a place where Palestinian activism was not suppressed until 2017. But at the same time that the student wrote an article accusing my article of anti-Semitism and connecting it to the IHRA definition, the anti-Semitism charges, there was also a campaign, really, it's a group, that calls themselves Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, had targeted a student at the University of Exeter, which is nearby, calling her anti-Semitic because of her tweets from 5 years earlier. She was a student from Gaza, and said that this happened at the same time. Anyway, so there was a kind of something was organized, and there's just a lot of sense of articles being withdrawn from curriculum, people being silenced, and it became clear. And it was interesting to me that this kind of definition was being so useful. I mean, it was so useful in censoring, and I'd never seen that happen before. That particular kind of mechanism of censorship was totally new to me, and so it just opened my eyes to, I guess, the way bureaucracies work and the way governments work.
Let's talk a bit about one of the things a couple of things struck me here in the book. A lot of things struck me in this book. It's really well written. It's a very intense read, which is the reality of anti-Semitism, the depth of anti-Semitism in this world that is just kind of in the DNA of Western society
Hmm.
that you write about, um, and how you see that kind of pain turning into oppression. You have these great quotes by Isaac Deutscher all over the place, and I'm a fan of Isaac Deutscher, so I really enjoyed you kind of pulling him into
As
this.
am I. Right.
Yeah, because when I was young, when I was 15, I was a teenage trot. That's where I got introduced to Isaac Deutscher. So,
Uh-huh.
but
Wonderful.
at any rate, he said, we have the quote, "Religion, I am an atheist. Jewish nationalism, I'm an internationalist. In
Hmm.
neither sense am I therefore a Jew. I am, however, a Jew by force of my unconditional solidarity with the persecuted and the exterminated. I am a Jew. I feel the pulse of Jewish history because I should like to do all I can to assure that the real, not spurious security and self-respect of the Jews." So this
Hmm.
this is part of your journey as well.
Right.
And when you kind of look at both the depth of anti-Semitism, how that created what became Israel, how that created this oppression of Palestinians, and you weave this tale around that before we get to free speech, which we'll get to in a
Hmm.
minute.
Sure, of course. Right. Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out. So Isaac Deutscher is also a very big inspiration to me. But it's also interesting that, he speaks for a generation, I think, a generation of a certain kind of, certainly geographic space. I'm thinking of, Polish Jews from the or Jews of the former
Yeah.
Russian Empire from
Right.
the shtetl.
Right. Right.
It is just astonishing how many of them, turned towards radical leftism. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, these are anarchists who migrated to America. I think they didn't talk so much about being Jewish, but it doesn't seem like a coincidence. There was definitely a kind of demographic phenomena of
And let me just
Jews.
say, and Leon
Yeah,
Abram, who I never heard of until I read your book.
absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. I love him. I mean, I wasn't very familiar with his work either, and it hasn't been given a lot of visibility. So I think, yeah, absolutely, this is a similar demographic. I mean, they were all born. I think everyone, yeah, all of these people I just mentioned, either Poland or the former Russian Empire, and they experienced this is like forced segregation, limited economic opportunities. It was, and that pushed them, and they all became very on the left. They saw themselves as their struggle as one that had to do with workers across internationally, anti-colonialism. Rosa Luxemburg, it would be another.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's. I think he speaks for a very broad sector of a certain world that is not. A lot of that was annihilated by the Holocaust to some extent, not entirely, but yeah. So that it, yeah, and I'm any chance I can get to talk about. And so I think that's actually a name that he assumed, Abram Leon. I often, for some reason, I mix up the order of names as well. But yes, this is a wonderful author of a book that is called in English, "The Jewish Question." He wrote in French in Nazi-occupied Belgium, and I'm just astonished. So he had obviously very limited access to scholarship or scholarly resources, but working under incredibly difficult constraints. But he produces this kind of scholarly masterpiece about the history of anti-Semitism, incorporating it's kind of he's inspired by Max Weber, so he uses looks at it through a very sociological lens. But he also talks about colonialism. He connects the exploitation of the Jews throughout history to the way the colonies are exploited. I think that's pretty astonishing. I mean, he was writing in the 40s, and yeah, yeah. So that's a tradition that we really need to explore and keep alive and be aware of, at least in the present.
So, but then you also kind of go into the whole, I mean, the whole question of free speech,
Hmm.
which I find, and into the complexity of that.
Hmm. It
And
is complex.
right, and so
Definitely complex. Yeah.
to defending everybody's right to free speech, at the same time talking about the silencing of speech
Hmm.
that's taking place, especially if it has to do with being with Palestinian oppression.
Hmm.
And talk a bit about, yeah, so talk a bit about that in terms of what you discovered.
Sure. So I think, some of my kind of shock about the whole thing that was happening to me is, as I mentioned already, this sense of being silenced, even when most people I was in conversation with, I'm talking about like university administrators and so forth, even when they didn't necessarily disagree with me, but I was still silenced, right? So, and I think, there's a part of me that I'm not generally sort of very American in most of my ways, but I am of American. I was born in the United States, and I think there was this kind of unconscious First Amendment just orientation to me that really was really, yeah, amazed by the way in which it was seen as just being okay not to be allowed to express one's views, and that so that yeah, that was kind of my personal. At the time, I was also reading about prisoners in Iran, because that's a book area that I wrote a book on, and there just seemed to be a kind of unexpected parallels between the silencing that they were experiencing and what I was experiencing. And I realized, because I think I'd always thought of free speech as something that either in the liberal democracies, it's something that kind of the right wing only talks about, whereas in maybe places like Iran, it's something that the left is concerned with. But in my world, it's not really like a big issue in my, like, I'm not, I don't want to go out there preaching racism to anyone, so it's not something that I personally have to struggle with. Like, I'm okay with hideous views being silenced. But I think anti-Semitism is a really interesting case, because you know I obviously, I don't think my article was anti-Semitic. But if someone comes to me who is a Holocaust survivor, for example, and says, this article that you wrote makes me very uncomfortable. I think you're too critical of Israel. I guess there's a part of me, maybe I'm a little bit more. You used the word dialectical. I think that was a very interesting word, right? There's a part of me like I think it's important just to acknowledge what people feel, right? So I feel like that it's very difficult to argue about these questions of anti-Semitism. There is so much difference of perception, right? With one person, because I do think there is an objective way of figuring out what's anti-Semitic and not, but I also think there's just a wide margin of emotions and traumas and everything else that goes into this question, that we kind of do need to find a way of just respecting everyone's right to feel what they feel and think what they think, right? So if, say, a Holocaust survivor, for example, is probably not going to be in danger walking down the streets of London, right? But perhaps they have this very, very traumatic memory somewhere back in their past that's made them afraid. And I'm not going to be the person to say, okay, they're idiots. Let's just, you know what I mean? They don't have a right to feel what they feel. So I guess what I'm saying is I feel that people, but this is the case though, because still, I'm not going to accept, therefore, that seeing a Palestinian flag, for them to see a Palestinian flag in London is an example of anti-Semitism. I don't accept that, but I do kind of want to respect where they're coming from. And so, in other words, it means that as someone who believes in these different perspectives, the legitimacy of them, I have to acknowledge things that contradict each other in society, right? And there are different perspectives, and I think the question of defining anti-Semitism is an area where there's never going to be a world in which everyone completely agrees. We're not going to get there. And there are some things are black and white, right? Like when to do with hate crimes, but there are other much grayer areas. Usually these are areas to do with speech and attitudes and perceptions. And I think it's more important to just let people debate, let people voice their views, rather than trying to outlaw them.
And it's also very difficult. I mean, one of
Hmm.
the things in that chapter in your book that struck me was the difficulty to wrestle with, are there limits,
Hmm. Hmm.
and how you even begin to talk about that. I mean,
Right.
to protect everyone's right to say what has to be said,
Hmm.
even if you despise what they're saying,
Yes.
even if
Yes.
they
Not a
are
popular
right. I mean,
position.
and
Sure.
in this day and age,
Uh-huh.
it's hard on many levels because to allow racist speech to take place in universities or
Hmm.
anti-Semitic speech to take place in universities is become a really controversial piece, left and
Absolutely.
right,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
definitely. There's a much people I think these days are much more in favor of banning books or it's trying other ways of getting the views that are problematic to kind of disappear. But that hasn't worked, in the past, and I'm not sure it's worked in the present. And yeah, I think one can look at it from a kind of just a practical perspective. When has that worked? Usually the views are still there. The people whose views are silenced tend to think that the fact that they're being censored makes them feel more righteous and more justified. I think personally, anti-Semitic points of view often can be disproven. I mean, empirically, right? And racism is empirically incorrect. It can be, um, reason can not. I don't say completely, but to some extent, it can be debated, um, maybe not out of existence, but dramatically reduced just by using the tools that we have of critical thought, debate, and yeah, that I think we have to have some faith in that.
So I want to kind of ask you this one piece here that you have some great lines in here, like any other racism, anti-Semitism can exist in the absence of intent.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think, and
Absolutely.
it shows how deeply how pervasive racism and anti-Semitism
Yes.
are.
It can completely. And I do want to, yeah, there's one comment I would like to make on that, and then an additional point about free speech I didn't quite make.
Go ahead.
I also just want to say that one thing I often hear, by well-intentioned people, who want to kind of support me or who wanted to support me in terms of when I was accused of anti-Semitism, was that, oh, that's a Jewish name. You have Jewish heritage, so you can't be anti-Semitic. But I actually don't agree with that. I don't think I'm anti-Semitic, but it's not. I don't think that there's no get out of jail free card from any identity. anyone is vulnerable to any kind of racism, any kind of bad thinking, and we shouldn't personalizing in that way doesn't help us, right? So yeah, so that I think that's absolutely true. It goes well beyond intent. It's structural and it's material as well. And the other thing about free speech and kind of what my actual experience, of being accused of something and then defending myself against the accusation in a university taught me is that yes, I certainly would want to be part of the movement that challenges racist thought, and I want to be part of the movement that challenges anti-Semitic thought. But the problem is that when you have to think very, very carefully about what kind of agencies and agents, like institutions, are you empowering? Not you personally, obviously, but when we create regulations or laws, but particularly this kind of, like the IHRA definition, is not technically a law, but it kind of functions as a law
Right,
sometimes.
right.
We create these regulations that are kind of aimed to eradicate a certain way of thinking or a certain approach, a certain mental attitude, right? Um, just by creating that law, by basically creating a bureaucracy for their implementation, we are empowering certain kinds of institutions to punish, right, or to marginalize. And so it's for me, it's not just a question of like the content of what's right and what's wrong. It's about power. So if you're creating a regulation, you're giving an institution, you're giving a government, like the conservative government, in this case the conservative government of the UK and their various apparatuses, you're empowering them to do certain things to silence certain points of view. And I think that that's problematic, entirely separate of the content of what's being supported and not. It's also about power, and I think that's important to remember about speech.
So I wonder what conclusion you come to. And let's talk. I mean, I could
Hmm.
I could read 10 different passages here, but we don't have so much time, right? And
Right.
how you would see anti-Semitism, the role it played in forcing people to go to Palestine, as you quote Deutsche,
Hmm.
creating this oppressive system with Palestinians, and how you see that changing. I mean, you have these great lines in here about around how the anti-Semitism, the ending of it, is wrapped up in the liberation of Palestinians.
Yes.
I mean, it's like
Right.
it's almost time for new definitions.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that I guess one way of sort of responding to that is that, historically, there have been intersections between the Jewish people, Jewish experience and Palestinian experience, if you go back centuries. But I think at this particular moment, 21st century, their histories are becoming ever more intertwined. And there's a great quote that Edward Said once used, or that the Palestinians are the Jews of the Arab world. I think that kind of speaks
I
volumes
Yes,
to me.
yes. He,
Yeah.
he and I actually talked about
Mhm.
that one day on my radio show. Yes, yes.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's I think what I had in mind when I wrote that at this point the histories are not separable. And in a sense that's a good thing. That's where we have that's where there's a kind of potential for violence, but that's also where there's a potential for peace. It's the parallels, they've intersected so closely. And I think there's a role for understanding the Nakba and the Holocaust as also being intertwined.
So how do you think, listen, how do you think, given all you wrote and the people you wrote about,
Hmm.
and the kind of demise of in some ways of the power of the left and the Jewish Marxist left, at any rate, that you
Hmm.
write about, how that
Hmm.
fits into all this in terms of the future landscape?
Hmm.
Because it does change things. I mean, it changes things
Yes.
drastically.
Sure. Well, I think one thing that this shows, I mean, potentially some of the most important thinkers on this issue have often, or the important thinkers in general, in terms of creating revolutionary change, have often been from the diaspora. And it may be, I mean, I think historically the American diaspora, for example, has or yeah, I think there's a potential for the diaspora to change the conversation to some extent. I mean, a lot of Palestinians are leaving, Israelis are leaving their country, and it may be that they'll find in migration some kind of space for creating communities that are very difficult to create in the ground. I suppose that's one. I mean, I'm thinking of that. That's a pattern that one sees also in the Jew in the Polish Jews of the 19th century and the early 20th. that they created new worlds like Emma Goldman, when they
Yep.
migrated.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and I also find that a lot of a lot of these Israelis on the left are now in Europe. They're not there
that's
anymore.
yeah,
They're gone. I mean,
100%.
yeah,
That's true.
you
Yeah.
know, and I think the way you frame that in terms of the Jewish Marxist tradition and what that really has to teach.
hmm
I mean, and even when you write about Isaac Deutscher's development and his
Yeah.
change,
hmm
what happened in 1967, how that really changed the way before he died, how that really kind of changed his whole view of what was going on. Because as a Holocaust survivor, he was like, "Yes, we want Israel, but then what just happened?" Right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think if you look at the scholarship being produced by Israelis in Europe, who are are very critical of their country and of that history, it's definitely gives us a new way of seeing the history and the legacy, and then therefore a new way of seeing the future.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. I really do recommend getting this book, Erasing Palestine, by Rebecca Ruth Gould. It's engrossing and worth the read to wrestle with the ideas she puts forth. It's an easy read about a complex subject. So thank you, Rebecca. Good to have you with us. I'm really happy you could join us today.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
And I want to thank Cameron Grandino on the other side of the glass, making his studio magic, and Kilo Rivara for making the wheels turn here and allowing all this to happen, and everyone at Real News for making this show possible. Please tell me what you thought about what you heard today and what you'd like us to cover. Just write to me at mss@therealnews.com. I'll get right back to you. And while you're there, please go to www.therealnews.com/support. Become a monthly donor. Become part of the future with us. So for Cameron Gandino, Kilo Rivera, the crew here at The Real News, and our guest, Rebecca Gould, I'm Marc Steiner. Stay involved, keep listening, and take care.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.